Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly incredible lecture by Dr. Ted Hildebrandt on the Gospel of Luke. And listen, instead of just reading this as some basic ancient biography, we're going to look at the ancient author as a master storyteller and a meticulous historian. Think of this as the cinematic director's cut of the text, where literally every single scene, every character contrast, and every historical marker is placed there with a profound intention to guide the reader. We've got a massive amount of ground covered today, so here's our roadmap. Number 1, the Savior of all. Number 2, a tale of two rich men. Number 3, history and the critics. Number 4, the songs of Luke. Number 5, the marginalized and poor. And number 6, the ultimate eternal stakes. Section 1, the Savior of all. Let's dive right into Luke's central thesis, which really positions Jesus uniquely when you compare it to the other gospel accounts. See, while Matthew portrays Christ primarily as a sovereign king, and Mark shows him as the suffering servant, Luke introduces him as the savior of all flesh. And this theme, it's perfectly captured by the old man Simeon. Imagine the scene. He's finally holding the baby Jesus in the temple, and he just declares, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation." Simeon literally equates this physical baby with the very concept of salvation itself. It's a really powerful moment. And that brings us to a critical term you should know, soteriology. It's a big word, but it simply means the theological study of salvation. Dr. Hildebrandt points out that establishing this soteriological focus right out of the gate is absolutely crucial. The study of salvation is the core lens through which Luke directs his entire overarching story. He's constantly showing us a savior who is actively seeking out the lost. Section 2, Tale of Two Rich Men. To really understand how Luke illustrates the salvation in action, we have to deconstruct his literary genius. He uses this specific technique called intertextuality, placing two stories back to back so they play off each other. Just look at the stark contrast between these two very different wealthy men. On one hand, you have the rich young ruler. He was morally upright, kept the commandments, the whole shebang. But when he's commanded to give his wealth to the poor, he just couldn't part with it. He turns away sad. But then, juxtaposed against that, we have Zacchaeus. This guy was a corrupt, despised tax collector who actively ripped people off. Yet, without even being commanded, he voluntarily gives half of his wealth away and repays the people he cheated. The moral man fails, while the corrupt man finds salvation. The crucial point we're seeing here is this recurring triangulation motif. Basically, a seeker must overcome some sort of obstacle to finally reach Jesus. In Luke's narrative design, you often start with the seeker, like a blind man or Zacchaeus. Then, boom, you hit the obstacle. That could be a massive physical crowd, a person's physical height, or in the case of the rich young ruler, their own immense wealth. The dramatic resolution only happens when that obstacle is actually overcome, leading to a life-changing encounter. Luke also uses this fascinating framing device called an inclusio to open and close Zacchaeus' story. Think of an inclusio like literary bookends. The story opens with Jesus saying, "I must stay at your house today." And how does it close? With Jesus declaring, "Today salvation has come to this house." You see what he did there? Luke is explicitly linking the physical presence of Jesus with the literal arrival of salvation. Section 3, History and the Critics. Because Luke isn't just a theologian spinning compelling stories. He acts as a meticulous historian, grounding his narrative in the very real, very gritty Roman world. He desperately wants his readers to know this is rooted in actual time and space. To build that historical credibility, Luke intentionally hooks his timeline to secular leaders. He notes Jesus was born under Caesar Augustus and began his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. But there is a well-known debate here. Critics point out that the prominent ancient historian Josephus only recorded a census under Quirinius in 6 AD, which completely misses the timeline of Jesus' birth around 4 or 5 BC. However, scholars argue that dismissing Luke's earlier census is a flawed argument from silence. Basically, this is the assumption that if we don't have a written record of it today, it just never happened. But honestly, archaeology is incredibly fragmentary. We only have a tiny, tiny fraction of the historical data from that era. Plus, the Romans often allowed native customs to dictate censuses, like the Jewish practice of returning to ancestral towns, like Bethlehem. So just because a Roman document is missing, well, that doesn't instantly invalidate the text. Section 4, The Songs of Luke. Let's shift gears from history to artistry. Luke also serves as the sweet singer, or the psalmist of the New Testament. He literally weaves music directly into his narrative structure. He records 4 magnificent songs known today by their famous Latin titles: the Magnificat, which is Mary's song of praise; the Benedictus, Zacharias' blessing; the Gloria in Excelsis, sung by the angels; and the Nunc Dimittis, Simeon's peaceful departure. These aren't just filler, folks. They're the emotional soundtrack of the gospel, capturing these intimate, incredibly joyful reactions to the arrival of salvation. Section 5. The Marginalized and Poor. That soundtrack we just talked about, it brilliantly illustrates how Luke specifically elevates voices that the ancient world often just ignored, repressed, or cast aside. Throughout the text, Luke pays special attention to his supporting cast. He heavily elevates women, noting individuals like Mary Magdalene and Joanna, who actively supported Jesus' ministry. He also displays a deep, recurring sensitivity to parents losing only children, like the widow of Nain's son and Jairus' daughter. And through it all, he continually emphasizes voluntary generosity to the poor, showing us a God who is intimately concerned with the vulnerable. Now, when examining the modern tension between the social gospel, which champions social justice, and spiritual salvation, which champions redemption from sin, Dr. Hildebrandt notes that for Luke, it's really a both-and scenario. True generosity to the poor isn't some mandate forced upon people in these texts. It flows voluntarily from a changed heart. It's exactly like what we saw earlier with Zacchaeus. Section 6. The ultimate eternal stakes. Ultimately, Luke's narrative drives toward the eternal consequences of human choices. The intense focus on how we treat the poor and how we handle wealth comes to a stunning climax in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Here, Luke presents a shocking eternal reversal. The marginalized beggar covered in sores, he's dignified with a name, Lazarus, and ends up comforted at Abraham's side. Meanwhile, the incredibly wealthy man who lived in absolute luxury is totally stripped of his identity. He suffers anonymously in agony. In eternity, their earthly statuses are completely inverted. When discussing the agony of hell mentioned in the text, Dr. Hildebrandt explains the linguistic roots of the word Gehenna. It derives from the Valley of Hinnom. This was a literal burning trash dump outside Jerusalem, where terrible historical atrocities, including child sacrifices, once occurred. So it was an incredibly visceral, potent metaphor for ancient readers used to describe eternal separation and ruin. Now, the lecture impartially outlines a few different interpretations of the afterlife that scholars still debate today. There's universalism, the idea that everyone eventually makes it to heaven. There's annihilationism, the view that the wicked simply cease to exist entirely. And there's the traditional view, arguing for eternal separation based on our choices. While acknowledging all these debates, Dr. Hildebrandt emphasizes that the biblical text heavily stresses the reality of eternal consequences and a stark separation of the sheep and the goats. The parable of Lazarus actually concludes with this really haunting realization. The rich man begs for someone to rise from the dead to warn his brothers, but Abraham replies, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. Even if someone rises from the dead, they will not be convinced." It's a chilling foreshadowing of Jesus' own resurrection, warning that even miraculous signs won't change a heart that willfully refuses to listen to the truth. And this brings us to the ultimate question the lecture poses to us. It's a heavy one to ponder, honestly. Do the decisions we make right now have eternal ramifications? Do the choices we make in our finite 80-year lives truly echo into eternity? The overarching takeaway from Luke's masterful narrative is perfectly summarized right here. Now matters. Your choices matter. Human agency is deeply honored in this narrative. What you decide to do with your life, your resources, and your beliefs right now has profound, lasting significance that goes far beyond the present moment. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. If the Gospel of Luke is the ultimate director's cut of history and salvation, what role are you choosing to play in it? How will you apply the lessons of the seeker, the poor, and the rich men to your own life today? Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and keep seeking the truth.